Weather analysts have been collecting data for over a century, and there is data suggesting that average local temperatures have increased during that time. We'll check in with local experts about what effects changing climate patterns have and could have in our area. That's coming up next on WNIN Newsmakers. Thanks for joining us. I'm Amy Mangold. We've gathered a few experts to discuss where we stand locally with changing climate patterns. Our first guest recently retired from the National Weather Service and is now a consultant for the University of Alabama and heads a consulting business called Disaster Resiliency Experts. Tim Troutman, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me today. It's good to be here.
Well, with all your time with the Weather Service, let's first start off by distinguishing what is the difference, and a lot of people don't understand, between climate and the weather and weather patterns.
Okay, weather and weather patterns, typically, you're looking at the short term, the next few days. That's really what most folks are really interested in. What's going to happen today, tomorrow, through the next 7 days. That's going to be your weather part of the forecast. Once we get outside of that 7-day outlook, then we're looking to the 8 to 14 days, in the weather business, then the 1 month, 3 month climate outlooks, I guess you could say at that point. Once you get into climate, that's more or less a study of the averages of temperatures, precipitation. Because of the skill that's involved, outside of the 7-day forecast at this point, that's where we have to really go for the averages at that point out, because of the technology we have. We have the best technology in the world as far as weather forecasting, but still there are limitations.
Well, and climate is not just local to our area, correct? I mean, it's very interconnected, and our climate depends on other patterns in other areas of the world. Can you kind of describe that a little bit and explain that?
Yeah, the overall weather pattern in the short term leads to the longer term climate pattern worldwide. So what we have going on here in the tri-state area, since we've had significant weather records that's been reliable since 1879 here in the Evansville area when the U.S. Weather Bureau office started here. Wow. That time frame in that 1897 to the current time period, we can look at that 100-year plus averages of temperatures over that longer period and see, well, how have the low temperatures progressed over the years? How have the high temperatures progressed? How's precipitation changed over this longer continuum of time? And that helps us to determine, well, are the temperatures warming? Or the low temperatures warming, or the high temperatures warming over a period of time? Or when you take your low and high temperatures and you average them together, that's your average temperature. Is your monthly average temperature, is that going to be different over a period of time? So there's a lot of statistics that go into that, and we've looked at the data worldwide, of course, and since about 1880, there's been an average temperature overall increase of 1.9 degrees. And you think, well, 1.9 degrees, that's minimal, right? Well, when you get above about a degree in temperature change, I mean, that's in a long period of time, that's still consistently significant. Just because, looking at the data over a longer period of time, that in the changing phase of the climate, that could tell us that, well, if it's increased this much since 1880, how much more is it going to increase due to what we're dealing with in the world today with increased pollution, increased, the things that are fossil fuel and CO2 emissions? How's that going to increase as we get to 2050, 2100? So that's where researchers have, across the world, have looked at this and have come to unfortunately some negative startling conclusions that based upon the trending right now, we are headed toward definitely some significant issues in relation to climate change, and climate is changing.
So I know that some people have the perception or the attitude that 1 degree or 2 degree increase in climate,
Yeah.
how could that be changing climate? Because we still freeze here, we still see hard frost, we still see the icing, those types of things. So what do you say to someone who is comparing snapshots of weather occurrences now and utilizing that to formulate an opinion about climate change that might not track?
Okay, there's two sides to every issue, and I want to go right down the middle of that equation. The issue at hand is in the U.S. We've really taken accurate or semi-accurate weather records since about the mid-1700s. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, George Washington, some of those figures, they took weather observations each day. That was important because they were farmers, and they needed to know how warm it was from one day to the next, involving what they needed to do through the year, crops and their animals and things like that. So, getting a look at that snapshot of about greater than 250 years, just doing the math, how has that changed since then? And there's arguments from Thomas Jefferson in his diaries that he stated that, well, we're in climate change right now. And that was in the mid-1700s, and we were kind of moving out of a kind of like a miniature ice age at the time. So we were kind of in the depths of cooler than normal conditions, and we've been slowly warming over a period of time since then. Now, do we have enough of a data set to really state 100% sure where we're headed? Well, we really need more data to really have even a more accurate conclusion to that. But based upon what we've seen over the last 50, 75 years, and how the air pollution and the industrial revolution and everything that's been involved with the fossil fuel emissions and the CO2 increases, there's a lot of statistical evidence that shows that we are heading in the wrong direction if we don't start taking a look at how we can be a little more greener, plant more trees. Could we, get more solar panels to limit that fossil fuel emission, somewhat? I'm not saying getting rid of it, but maybe we should have more of an even balance to lessen worldwide if the other countries would do that, to maybe make it, if there's an increase in warming, make it a lot more gradual and a lot more flatter than a spike.
Okay. So bringing it down locally, have you noticed any recorded, or have you seen in the data any recorded changes in our weather patterns locally, and what kind of implications is that beginning to have?
I've been doing some research locally on the old Weather Bureau data that goes back to 1897 to the current, and you can tell from the data, and especially the Ohio River, when you were looking at data from the late 1800s to about 1950 or so, the Ohio River during that time period, every winter would freeze, and there would be quite a bit of ice chunks, and depending on the winter and how much cooling we had, there were isolated occurrences where the Ohio River completely froze over and people could walk from one side of the Ohio River to the other. We've not seen that anymore since that time frame, the mid 1900s. So I think that may be an indicator, of course, that we are in a warming trend. I think the overnight low temperatures, looking at the data, has been warmer over a longer period of time. The daytime high temperatures may per se not be as much of an increase. And we've had more of an extreme weather pattern that's been in place more recently. Just looking at some of the activity that's occurred near us. The December 10th tornado outbreak in western and south central Kentucky is an example. That being probably one of the largest tornado tracks in recent memory prior to the March 18th, 1925 tri-state tornado. So the examples like that, some of the large amounts of flooding in, down toward Tennessee, Nashville has been really extensively flooded out a couple of times last 10 years, and we're seeing some of these more drastic increases in, excessive rainfall amounts warming in certain times of the year where we're not normally expecting it. But this past winter did seem a little more kind of quote normal. So there are peaks of that compared to what we used to have. So are we going to be heading toward that direction? That's going to be the real question. And I think we have a hand we can play in that.
Right. Well, and is there science behind why changing climate patterns create extreme weather events? Or is there something that kind of drives that whenever you see these changes in patterns? Is it the jet stream, or how does that kind of all work together?
We do look at what we call La Nina climate pattern, and then the El Nino. The La Nina climate pattern is characterized by cooling of the waters in the Pacific. When that occurs, your storm track determines which part of the country is going to have a more significant spring severe weather season, flood season, where is the vast majority of what we call the jet stream, the conveyor belt of wind that brings the weather systems across the country. Where is that going to be setting up? And the last couple of winters, the upper Midwest has been more or less in the storm track. So that's been the player, I guess you could say, for more snow, more rain, and getting into the spring, and that's led to some of the flooding along some of the rivers and so forth. So that's something that we've looked at over periods of time, the researchers and throughout the weather business and climatology business, and that leads us to look at that direction. Right now we're in what we would call a slight to a moderate La Nina pattern. So the storm track is kind of getting more favorable right now for above normal precipitation across the area as we head into the spring. So that's something we're going to have to watch out for as we get into April and May for a more active severe weather season. So that's an important thing to think about in the short term.
Right. Is there a way, as you look at the data, the historical data, to kind of predict if we're going to see this continue, if we're going to see it worsen, and what effect it will have on these extreme weather events?
There definitely is a way that we can look at these patterns historically. We have what we call analogs, which are basically a historical depiction season by season previously. So we can look back and say, okay, the general patterns like 1975 or 2012. So looking at what happened that year and putting that in play together, we can kind of give ourselves an idea, looking at what we could expect, and then we can hopefully convey that information out to the public and users as to what the potential could be.
Well, you alluded to it earlier, but in your disaster resiliency consultancies, how do we start to mitigate some of this? What do we do to help the process and to prevent some of this?
I think what we can do as collectively is to, plant more trees. For every tree you cut down, add 3. Something like that. That's just small that any of us can do. We can, conserve energy as much as possible, combine things, recycle as much as we can. A lot of us are doing that. We're doing these important things. I think it's important that, we look at some of the newer, greener energies that are out there. I know a lot of folks are getting panels for solar panels, and there's a lot of wind turbines out there that are generating that necessary energy, and a lot of the electric companies are utilizing the big solar panels and the turbines to gather that and harness the wind and the sun's energy to lead to more and improved ways that we can limit that increased carbon footprint. That's what we want to do.
True. And it's interesting, during the COVID pandemic, especially at the beginning of it, whenever we were all at home, there were some articles about how the hole in the ozone layer and some of that carbon footprint had actually been reduced. Has that sustained itself? Has it gotten worse? Was it kind of a blip in the radar? How do we look at that kind of thing?
Well, more or less a blip. I mean, if you set off a lot of the industrial power and the what we generate that occurred at that point, it did lead to a lessening of that footprint. And it cleaned up some of the air pollution and things that for a certain period of time there, for a few months maybe. But since we've opened back up, though, we're headed back more to a normal that we've had. So that's kind of how that works, for obvious in that sense reason. So, but the thing I can stress, it's important to take a look at these other alternative methods, and if you have a way to do that, consider it. That might be your way of making your mark.
So, kind of going back to that, how long does it take? What timetable of data do you look at to determine that a weather pattern is actually becoming a climate change pattern? Is there kind of a formula to that?
Well, weather is going to be in your short term, maybe a week or something like that. Climate studies, they're in longer time periods, looking at years and years worth of data. And that's really that separates the weather from the climate. The climate is an overall longer term pattern of the conditions that exist. Temperatures, precipitation, the amount and lack thereof. And right now we're dealing with a lot of extreme weather in relation to wildfires due to the drought conditions out west. The country is. There's a lot of melting in the glaciers and the polar ice caps that's increasing slowly the sea levels. There is definite, probably some good statistics that show by 2050 that the sea levels will increase by about a foot. So you've got some areas that are, such as Miami and New Orleans that are sitting at 6.5 feet above sea level already. So you lop off a foot, now you're down to 5.5, in those type of situations. So some of that nice ocean and sea frontage that we're looking at and we vacation at, that's going to be an issue potentially.
Yeah, it'll be in their yards instead, won't it?
Unfortunately.
Well, Tim, thank you so much. Lots of great information. We really appreciate your expertise. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Now we're joined by Chris Lee, a conservation delivery team leader at the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, to continue to discuss how changing weather patterns can affect rural areas. Thanks so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
Appreciate your time. So in what ways do changing weather patterns affect agricultural production? Because it's crucial, correct?
Oh, absolutely. For the most part around here, we still get about the same amount of precipitation as we always have, around 45 to 50 inches per year. But the timing in which we get that rainfall has seemed to change some in the last few decades. So the timing of the rainfall is important to agriculture. The other thing is intensity of the rainfall. We seem to be getting our rainfall in more intense storms instead of those gentle showers. The gentle April showers bring May flowers, type of thing. So
exactly. So how have farmers and even people who live in rural areas, how have you seen them adapt? Have they adapted the way that they're producing crops? Have they adapted the way that they're living? Those types of things.
Well, as far as crop production goes, I think one of the things you'll see is planting times, deciding when to plant. Soil temperature is going to play a pretty serious role in that as well. So they may delay planting, let's say, because a lot of times folks want to go out there and just start planting in April, and we've seen that happen a few years, and then it get cold again in late April, early May, those types of things. So there may be some things like changing planting times. The other thing would be looking for plant genetics that more fit the current conditions that are on the ground right now. So selecting crops, genetics that are going to fit the weather pattern that we're experiencing at this time.
Well, in our conversation before the show began, we talked a little bit about maybe changing the way that they plant and how they plant their crops, the times that they plant it, and planting new cover crops. Can you explain that a little more and how that benefits?
Yes, we've seen a huge increase in the last 20 years on the number of acres of cover crops planted in Indiana. I think we're like nearing the 2 million acre mark in Indiana for cover crops being planted, which that's a significant amount. See, normally when you plant a crop, it's your cash crop. So 120 days of the year you have this cash crop growing, and the rest of the year there's nothing going on with the soil. So a lot of people become interested in cover crops, and you're utilizing that sun's energy all year long. And those cover crops are there pulling energy out of the sun, pulling carbon out of the atmosphere, putting it into the soil, feeding the microorganisms that live below the soil, and just creating that whole community of life. And then when it's time to plant the cash crop, they come in and terminate the cover crop, plant the cash crop, and that way there's a living roots in the soil all year round.
Wow. And so do you feel like the potential for the cover crops might actually help improve the health of the soil and maybe conservation efforts in that regard for improving that?
Absolutely, because as cover crops grow, they're continuously exuding energy in the form of sugars into the soil to feed that microbiome that lives in the soil. So these cover crops feed the microorganisms that live in the soil, and as they do that, there's more and more soil organic matter, which is just basically carbon in the soil. And the more carbon you have in the soil, the more water the soil is able to absorb, which would mean less runoff from intense rains, that kind of thing. But it also improves all the nutrient cycles that the plant needs. The more carbon in the soil, the better the relationship with the macronutrients like nitrogen. It improves the water cycle in the soil. So there's no downside in agriculture to having more carbon in the soil.
So as we look at the changing weather patterns, have you seen a change or even a trend in some of the issues that farmers and agriculture are bringing to you in terms of conservation and ways that they can mitigate some of these changes?
Well, I think we've seen an increase in intense rainfalls, and when you get intense rainfalls, that water that falls on these farm fields, it concentrates and flows, and it creates erosion issues. So we can go out and address erosion issues with our producers and our customers and design practices and write conservation plans that help address that issue.
Okay. So when you look at these changes, does it affect our food supply? Have you seen any direct impact on that, either the food supply or water or anything like that?
I don't think we've experienced a direct impact on our food supply at this point in time, but what we could see is increase in like crops that are damaged because of storms like hail. Yeah. So if we get an intense storm and we get hail, it can really just wreak havoc on our crops. We got issues with wind that can blow crops down, make it difficult to harvest or reduce the yield and that kind of thing. Those things are usually very localized, so they're not often widespread like over entire counties or a state or anything like that.
So do you have any resources that agriculture, farmers, people in rural areas can tap into if they start to see some of these issues or be affected by some of these changing weather patterns?
Well, definitely. Each one of our counties pretty much has a USDA service center in it with a conservation planner that would be glad to come out and meet with that producer on their land, discuss all those resource concerns, and help them develop a conservation plan to address any of the resource concerns that they have. And we have programs through the U.S. Department of Agriculture that even oftentimes offers financial assistance to help implement some of those conservation practices.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being with us, Chris. Such important information, especially for those farmers and agricultural producers that are in our area. I hope they tap into some of the resources that you have to offer.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us today.
All right.
Well, thanks to all of our guests for joining us. Next week, we'll discuss USI's move to Division I athletics. Thanks for watching WNIN Newsmakers.